how do you define ADHD and like what did you kind of mean by outcomes?
So I guess like our generation, I feel when we were kids, like the solution to ADHD was medication, which
Yeah.
is fine. And like medication can certainly help you access interventions. But I'm not sure that when we were kids, there was as much focus on like the executive functioning and the systems you need to be in place and like awareness of like things that are more difficult for you. So
Mhm.
my oldest is in second grade. She'll be 8 this weekend. And she has ADHD inattentive. So really working on, we had masked it a little bit because I have visual schedules. I had a reinforcement system.
Mhm.
We work on a lot of things errorlessly. So her library book always goes on the counter. We come home, it goes on the counter. It lives on the counter, it doesn't move from the counter. You can read it on the couch, it goes back to the counter. So putting some of those systems in place and just like the recognizing like this is hard. You love crafts. That's amazing. You can play with any craft, but we have to have a system to go back to so you can access it again, that kind of stuff.
Mr. Clark After Dark is brought to you by Luxy. That's Luxy. Luxy is the standard for modern dating as it gives you a greater understanding of a potential match's intentions and background before you make your move. Swiping endlessly on other dating apps can be exhausting and often leaves you with only the leftovers in your dating pool. Luxy is an exclusive platform with just a 10 to 15% acceptance rate, as well as a profile and income verification feature, so you can be confident you're only connecting with those who meet your high standards. Their community guidelines emphasize safety, trust, and quality by strictly prohibiting scams, explicit content, and harassment. 2025 is your year to stop settling. With Luxy, there is no luck involved, just real connections with people who truly match what it is you are looking for. Download the Luxy app today to see if you qualify for a better chance of finding the right person for you. And now, back to the show. hmm Yeah, because I guess so. What are your what would you kind of look for, even in, like in adults, for like an ADHD symptom?
So hyper focusing to the absence of other things is a big one where like you are all into something regardless of everything else kind of falling apart around you. And then also the inattentive or the inability to sort of juggle multiple things, that planning and processing. My
hmm
husband came home the other day and he was like, "Have you ever heard of chunking something?" And I was like, "Yeah, yes, I work with lots of people. Yep, you and I have talked about this a lot." So like, when some people with ADHD can feel so overwhelmed by the things they have to do that they don't even know how to take that first step. And that's where like a lot of behavioral strategies can come into place, like behavioral
hmm
momentum or writing your list with something on it that says write list. So you've automatically checked something off. The idea of making your bed every morning because now I've accomplished something, it's getting that momentum
hmm
going. So some of those type of things.
Well, yeah, honestly, just the listing is too real, and do like an easy task just to make it like, oh yeah, I conquered the first objective. Maybe I'm playing into that. Maybe I have a bit of it as well, but I don't know. Where within your district, like, what do you find are the most common problems? Or not, maybe problems is the wrong word because something I hear often from like people who I know teach in elementary school is like, like, we have these kids who are like undiagnosed. So there's always a like a passive aggressive relationship between like parent and teacher and kind of talking about like you're obviously trying to work together, but obviously it can be difficult as a parent to like acknowledge that maybe there's something that needs to be addressed or worked on with your specific child. But like, I guess what how do you kind of suggest or advise in that situation?
So the other ripple to that is that teachers can't always speak really candidly or directly about that. So I work in the school district my children go to,
hmm
and so kinder or first grade year she was in SRBI for reading. So again, like I said, I'm dyslexic, so I was like, okay,
hmm
let's just go see if she's dyslexic. Let's not waste our time because intervention's not going to change dyslexia.
hmm
And we had a conference and we talked about it. And I went home and I thought about it and I came back to her teacher the next day and I was like, "Are you saying there's attentional concerns?" And she was like, "Off the record, yes." And I was like, "Okay, I'll do with that what I need to." So we went and got a neuropsych, and she does not have dyslexia, but she absolutely has ADHD. So
hmm
I even went back to my daughter's kindergarten teacher and I was like, "Were you trying to tell me that?" And I like didn't pick up on it. And I work in the school district, so I know
Yes.
the
Yeah.
things to ask. So I think that that's one difficult part of that. Teachers really can't say that. And the other part of it is similar to reading, writing, and math, there should be tiered intervention for behavior or attention, but I don't think it's as laid out as reading, writing, and math. So that's where it gets into this weird gray area. Ultimately, for me, like working in the schools, the diagnosis doesn't matter. We should still put some systems in place because
hmm
I mean, we should always have systems in place in addition to medication or a diagnosis. But if a parent doesn't want to diagnose, or they do, you get the label of ADHD, it shouldn't change what we want to put in place for that child.
Hmm.
Um, yes, I guess you technically need the diagnosis for a 504, but to be totally transparent, like 504s are just good teaching. And we shouldn't necessarily need a document to say that.
And that's kind of where it always kind of comes up that like usually, especially with behavior, like the best practices are kind of just like you're using the word system a lot, but to me, I'm like thinking of that as a routine. Like,
Mhm.
what is the difference between a system and a routine, or are they the same thing?
For sure. So, like my daughter, the inattentive type, she needs
Mhm,
directions given one at a time, ideally written down so she can reference it when she like kind of zones in and comes back out.
mhm,
So whether that's on her desk or put up on the board, it does like we have to teach her to attend to those cues. She's really
mhm,
reliant on social cues because she often will like sort of float away and come back, and she needs to look
mhm,
around and see what other people are doing. Her teacher this year was like, you cannot go to the bathroom during directions, like you have to go during independent work. So some of those, yeah, systems or interventions to be put into
mhm,
place. Like I said, a good teacher just does a lot of that naturally. But I felt like I needed those sort of strategies documented for her because I know she could fall through the cracks. Like she's a cusper in that sense.
mhm. And yeah, because I even noticed that, like, especially like when maybe not like a power struggle, but like when you are having that issue with parents, like when the kids are, especially at that young age, especially when they're starting school, you don't want them to be kind of like be separated from like their peer group. I guess like what are some of the questions that like obviously people who are not specialized in behavior would want to ask, like their kindergarten or preschool teacher?
So I would want data. I'm big on the data, but like when we're saying your child's having trouble focusing, what does that mean? Like, how big is this problem? Even when I work with parents now, I would ask them like for more specific data from the teacher because twofold. One, you can be sort of subjected to like if the last 20 minutes of the day were particularly rough, the teacher said, "Oh, the whole day was tough," or if the last 20 minutes were great, but the more, so really looking at our day and like looking at what the trend is and also comparing it to a peer. I just wrote an FBA for a second grader and I took like four different analysis of four different subjects and a peer as well, just to really articulate like how far off age appropriate this is. And it was a random peer each time. It was the same gender, but I switched, I didn't know the kids in the class, so I just picked someone. But for me, if as a parent, that's what I would want to know. How big of a problem is this? And the other thing though that's cautious that I caution parents on there is even with my own daughter, I had said to her teacher, again, I work in the district, I said, if I hadn't brought this to you, and she was like, honestly, I got bigger fish to fry in the class. And so you
Yeah.
really, really need to advocate for your kid because there's a spectrum of disabilities. And if your kid's not that big of a problem, you're going to fall through the cracks. And then fifth grade's going to be really, really tough because you haven't gotten those systems or interventions in place.
Mhm. Yeah, because it's always like it's never from like a bad place where the teachers are usually showing concern, and I would say that's like for the most part.
Oh,
Obviously, I'm generalizing, but I guess have you ever had the have you ever had the experience where like the parent acknowledges there's an issue, teacher acknowledges there's an issue, they work together, but then they're very like inconsistent on how they implement it, meaning like it's different at home and different at school. Because I guess it's almost sometimes the assumption that like school's going to fix their kid, quote unquote. And I don't mean to, you're not speaking about like anything directly, but I guess how would you, and because the teachers, again, especially if you're like newer, you don't really have that ground of experience to kind of like say no, like we're doing something wrong here. So you're always trying to be like, okay, like you guys got it, but then you're obviously you're putting up with almost on a daily basis not having the routines put out consistently.
so it is really tricky. The way the family behaviorist was born was that I was writing behavior plans, and my old boss at the time was like, "Okay, when you make these behavior plans, I want you to meet with every family that wants to talk about the systems put in place and like how they could implement them in their own home." And then we also turned into a little bit of like what it looks like at home.
Mhm.
Ultimately, though, we can't control that environment.
Yes.
So the parents, you can suggest it, you can show them the data on what's
Mhm.
effective, but sometimes as a teacher, you have to separate. Like home is going to be what home is, and we can't
Yeah.
control that. So what system, what can we do at school? In in the reverse of that, my daughter wouldn't, like, she has a folder that went back and forth to school, and there was like a
Mhm.
field trip slip in there, and it was there for 3 days. And I was like, "What are you doing? You take it out, you open it." So I started like intermittently putting something in her folder, like a piece of candy or a chapstick, and because then if I did it intermittently, she would always have to check her folder to be able to see if it was there, which would prompt her to take the item out. So I don't think a teacher has the ability to do that for
No,
everything.
no. Yeah.
So, but same idea. So if the kid's not taking their homework out at home, what could the teacher do intermittently to like prompt them to take it out if they don't have the support from the parents? That being said, I get raked by the teachers. Like that's a lot of work. It's most things team up and kind of check in and do all of that, but we can't control that environment.
Yeah, and so what is a 504 specifically? Because I know, like, even, like, we have, like, the 40 level, diagnoses, and then we have, like, the ones in the 50s that are, like, the learning disabilities, and one, like, a 50 code 54 is a behavior one. So what do you mean by a 504 specifically?
Yeah, so in Connecticut, there's an IEP, which is specialized instruction, and that comes with like
Mhm,
goals and objectives. A 504 is just accommodations, and it can sometimes
mhm,
include counseling. But so my daughter's 504 includes like extra time or alternative setting or
mhm,
like directions given incrementally, or strategically sat on the carpet or given an option to sit on a chair. Those sort of accommodations. So that's the difference. But I worry that she'll need explicit direct instruction when she gets older, which I'll do on my end, but she'll probably
mhm.
also need it at school, which would then become an IEP.
Okay. And what is kind of your, maybe position's the wrong word, but because you kind of talked about it with the, like, putting like a treat in the folder to kind of make sure she looks at it. What is kind of your stance on using rewards for these kinds of activities? Because again, every time, even though I'm not a parent, like, even as I was kind of looking through some of like the topics that I wanted to explore with you today, of like things like, I mean, physical punishment obviously is not one of them, but things like reward negotiation, like the teacher versus friend balance, like the parent, like so many things parallel as like a teacher in the classroom versus, obviously, like, we are kind of the acting parent in the classroom. But I guess first off, like, what's your stance with reward?
I wholeheartedly believe in rewards.
Okay, incentive.
Yes, and here's the reason why. Like, so a lot of parents will say that to me, like, I don't want my kid to be dependent on rewards. So twofold. One, we have to fate that. We have to have a structure to fate them. You don't have kids, but I've potty trained three. They
Yeah.
don't get M&Ms anymore, I promise. So like sometimes you have to be really strategic about it. And sometimes like I don't remember how it ended, but it ended. But the other part of that I say to parents is like, they say, I just want them to be internally motivated. Okay, but they're not. So now what? In my opinion, you would bring in external motivation to tie it to the intrinsic motivation and then fade the external motivation. And obviously, hopefully, the internal motivation takes over. But if that doesn't exist, I think you need something to get that ball rolling. The other part of that is that any behavior that's existing or increasing is coming in contact with some reinforcement. So whether that's your praise, whether that's, the clean space that they like the reinforcement for me changing my sheets is I really like the fresh sheets. So there's something there that's existing. So you have to compete with whatever is naturally existing.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's honestly like, I was even thinking about it this morning, like, what do I actually know about behavior? Because I even find myself being in like the latter stages of high school, especially like grade 11 and 12. Usually, when it comes to a student's, like, we call them IPPs, so like an individual program plan. I don't know why they just decided to choose different names all across the continent, but that's for another day, I guess. It's always like, okay, usually it's, like extra time or alternative space. Like those kind of accommodations are typically the norm.
Mhm.
And there isn't a lot of like, I like we do, like, I always found the goals, I think maybe arbitrary is the wrong word, but maybe because, like, do you think that the goals are more designed? So I guess, for example, we do like a long-term goal with an IPP, right? And then subsequent to the long-term goal, we will have like short 6 week to 8 week goals that we'll have. So our long-term goal will be, so and so will have less outbreaks during class, or they will actually attend class 75% of the time. And then we do like, oh, between this time and this time they'll do 60%. Obviously, I know that you're aware of this, but I'm kind of just thinking out loud in terms of the goals almost seem, like they're they're looking for pretty much just like acting in like a normal way, if that makes sense.
So
So
fair. So
yeah.
what you're talking about is shaping behavior. So like technical
Mhm,
definition,
yeah.
systematic approximations to a terminal behavior, but ultimately, like what
Mhm,
steps do we need to take to get them to where they are? Um,
mhm,
and you know, the to your point about it being like normal behavior, we're not there though. So an analogy
yeah.
somebody made for me once was like, I'm capable of getting up at 5 a.m. and working out. I'm totally capable of it. I've done it in the past. Haven't done it in months. So the idea
Mhm,
that if I were to be like, okay, tomorrow you have to get up at 5 a.m. every day of the week, like, you know, for the next month, that's unrealistic. I'm so far away from that right now that that's not
mhm,
realistic. So a realistic goal would be for the next 2 weeks of May, twice a week at 5 a.m. And so I want to shape it to, yes, other people are
mhm.
capable of that, but that's not where I'm at right now. So how do I get there?
Yeah, and I guess, like, the other part is it almost becomes more accommodation, and I almost feel like in a helpless sense of, I don't really know how to help them other than just providing these accommodations. Like, it never seems like there's a way to actually correct the behavior permanently, it's almost just dealing with it. Is that kind of the goal, though?
So yes and no. We would want to teach them to advocate for whatever accommodations that they do
Mhm,
need ultimately. So like I in high school, I had a teacher who helped me get organized. I had some executive functioning stuff, and so everything was in 3 ring binders. So I had a teacher sophomore year who every handout for the entire class was always 3-hole punched because he knew that I needed that. So getting to a place where I can advocate for that, or I have one with me, or like I can adapt to whatever, like to recognize the system that I need to have put in place. And the other part of that is replacement behavior. So instead of focusing on like their off task, like what do we need them to do? What does on task look like? How can we help them build that skill? So like a very silly example would be note taking. Like maybe it's fill in the blank notes because they need structure on how to take notes. And then maybe it moves forward to like more bullet points, you know, until we can get to a point where they can just listen to the lecture and take the notes. So really working on like the skill that's lacking.
oh, okay, so yeah, and yeah, that's kind of like like, you're trying to scaffold them into kind of the, I guess, like, basic norm of education. And so as a school counselor, I guess I always kind of viewed a school counselor as someone who, like, deals on more of the mental health side,
Mhm.
not just like the IPP side of things. I guess, like, what did you kind of see as some, like, the most common patterns of, like, mental health issues, or was that something that you dealt with?
Sure. So I work really closely with like our counselors and social workers, and I am a firm believer in like marrying the therapeutic and behavioral approach. So I'm going to give you an example. We had a student who would make like self harm comments, and we would have to do a risk assessment, and it would be an emergent thing, and then you know it was happening really regularly. So what we decided to do was like proactively have these built-in times of day to like we did this ASQR, this screening that we were trying to do more proactively so it didn't become this like emergent escape every time, while also providing one-to-one support, making sure that like he was safe. Like all of those things need to happen as well, but like what systems can we put in place to like meet the social emotional needs but also be mindful of like the function of the behavior, which could be escape or attention seeking. I mean obviously it's attention seeking, so how can we give the student either an appropriate way to get that attention, or you know what support do they need if that's you know a genuine feeling or it pops on a risk assessment or whatever that might look like.
Because and I almost find that myself, because I hear kind of two conflicting narratives. Like, I listened to an episode by, like, Dr. Becky. She's, like, one of, like, the
Yep.
famous, like, psychologists, and she was talking about, like, kids need boundaries. Like, they need to kind of know where you are at and, like, what they can and cannot do and, like, where the line ends. Um but I almost find myself, it's been my personal experience, like, one of the reasons I became a teacher, to, like, kinda go back, was, like, my dad had cancer when I was in high school. I had teachers that helped me, and I kinda wanted to be that for other students eventually, and, like, obviously, that's a it's a good story, etcetera, but I've even noticed myself when I'll like, a student will come up to me, and they'll share, like, something, like, very, not like a traumatic incident, but just something, like, going on in their lives, like, their parent is sick, and I almost find I lack the tools to, like, navigate that conversation other than just like listening, because I think you never want to jump in and like steal their thunder of like, oh, this is what happened to me, it was like just as bad. But you also don't want to be the one who's, like, you don't have anything to solve, But I
Yeah.
guess like what would be your advice and kind of when you're a teacher who's not like a behavior specialist or in like a psychology background to kind of navigate that conversation appropriately?
Yeah, I think it would be like creating that space, having, being able to listen, challenge, or, proposing possible replacement behaviors if that's asked of you. But I think
Mhm.
really just listening to the greatest extent. Because depending on whatever a student is disclosing, there might be like other steps that need to happen to help them get the support that they need. I think ensuring that you're somebody they feel comfortable talking to is definitely the biggest step.
Mhm. And so that kind of goes into the question of even in that scenario, kind of like that teacher versus friend balance. Because I know obviously it seems like you have a very and you're very open with like the times in your home where you're like, yeah, like things just didn't go to plan this morning, which I've always have a good chuckle at. Um, but like, how have you kind of balanced that like parent versus friend with your kids, like knowing what you know about behavior?
Sure. So, I mean, I think firm but caring. So,
Hmm.
one of the biggest things with the family behaviorist is I don't want anyone to think my kids are perfect because this is what I do. And I also
Hmm.
don't do it perfectly all the time. Like,
Hmm.
certainly try not to make it a habit to yell, but I get frustrated. I lose my cool for sure.
Hmm.
So, really working on what are those moments and what can you do in those moments. For example, I went upstairs the other night. The girls were supposed to have been in bed for like 20 minutes, and I heard a little pitter patter, and I walked in. And normally that would be something like frustrating and triggering to me, and I'd be like, "Get in bed.
Yeah.
It's 8:20, whatever."
Yeah. Yeah.
And I see my 2-year-old. She's almost 3, and I was like, "What are you doing?" She's like, "I got water." I go, "Okay. Do you have your water now?" And she's like, "Yes." I was like, "Okay. So now we'll go back in, and we're gonna, because like logically, there was nothing good that was gonna come of me being upset. It had already happened. If
Yeah.
anything, then they were both gonna be crying, and it was gonna be a whole thing. You're just like sort of meeting them where they're at. It is what it is and moving on. Now, that doesn't mean that's not something we're specifically working on right now. It's not a
Mhm.
pattern of behavior. It was kind of a one off. But if it was a pattern of behavior, like that's where I would use a delayed consequence. There would be no point to be like, all right, in the morning, you don't get blah, blah, blah. We'll revisit that conversation later and really focus on, again, replacement behavior. What can you do in those moments? What can you do in your room? All that sort of stuff.
Interesting. So, like, a delayed consequence is like, don't use the empty threat, but like talk about it the next day.
Right. So, like, for example,
Oh.
we went through like we did bedtime behavior for a while.
Mhm.
And that what happened the other day with the girls being up, it doesn't happen typically, but it
Yeah.
did. So that's fine. That's a one off. But if we had a plan in place where they were earning, chocolate milk in the morning, if they stayed in their room at night, they wouldn't have earned it. But going up and being like, okay, now you didn't earn chocolate milk is not going to help anybody go to bed. It's not going to help anything. I
Yeah.
suppose if they asked me directly, I'd answer. But in general, I would probably ideally try to do what I did the other night, which again, I don't do perfectly every time.
No, no. Yeah.
Okay, we have our water. It's 8:20. Alexa's off. It's time to be in bed. And then the next morning, it would be, did I earn? Oh, remember, we were up getting water really late. So, to then focus on what to do differently. So tonight, when we go to bed, let's make sure we have our water before mom leaves the room or whatever that might look like.
So it's kind of like the unexpected punishment in a sense, where that's like the what hits them actually in the moment. Ah, that's interesting.
And so, like, with
Eh,
that bedtime example, I work with a lot of families on bedtime. A lot of
yeah.
parents, the threats come out, and I get it. You're like done. It's
Yeah.
9 o'clock. Sit alone for a minute. You're done.
Yeah.
Like if you leave this room again, and it just doesn't really work. Again, not that I haven't done that. I totally have,
Of
but
course. Yeah.
instead, just really focusing on what to do in that moment, and then coming up with a plan to attack it more proactively the next night.
The chocolate milk thread. Yeah, that'll work. Are you more in the camp of like stop crying or like feel your feelings, let it play out, and then go from there?
So more in the camp of what is the function of the crying, right? And
Mhm.
what's your intention here? If your intention is access to the game, if I cry loud enough, dad will give it to me, then we want to teach you how to say, like, I'm naming your feeling and asking for whatever you need. So, like, I feel disappointed. Can I have a turn? If the function is attention, they want dad to come and solve the problem, really saying, like, it seems like you're having a hard time. You can say, can I have a turn or can we talk or whatever? So, no, I'm not in the camp of don't cry necessarily.
Yeah, and I know that was kind of like a it's not like an obvious question, like don't feel your feelings, but it's like that seems to be a common trend of especially like in teaching, it's like yell at them till they stop, change the behavior with force, and then move on.
And the biggest part about that is that you are so this is Parents typically and teachers respond to a behavior but don't teach what to do instead. So they're learning, don't cry over that, but they're not necessarily learning how to solve that problem. So like, I just won't play with the switch because whatever happens.
Mhm.
My middle is, have feeling her feelings a lot lately, and I cut up oranges and she shoved an orange in her little sister's face. So I took the oranges away. Like nobody has access to the oranges anymore.
Yeah.
Sobbing, and I said, I can tell you're having a lot of feelings right now, and I'll be happy to talk to you about them when you're ready. And you can just let me
Mhm.
know you're ready. So she went upstairs and took a bath and came back down and said, I'm ready. And I was like, okay. For her, a big one's jealousy. So she said, I felt very jealous. So
Okay.
working on like what are you trying to, unless you're trying to get my attention by that behavior, great. You can just get my attention by saying I feel sad, or you can tell me what you're feeling and we can work through it. So that, I think it's really important not to be careful about reinforcing the crying or the big emotions to get the validation. Like my middle went through a like nobody loves me phase, and I was like, oh my god, yes we do. And then it happened
Mhm.
again, I was like, oh my god, yes we do. And then the third time I was like, okay, I've officially taught her to like say nobody loves me so that I will tell her I love her. So one, tell her I love her more proactively, and two, work on naming her feeling. We did that and it was really successful. 2 weeks later, she was like, I'm feeling really jealous. And I was like, that's so great. I love the way you use
Oh.
words. And she's a middle. So I think that comes down to it for her a lot. But
Yeah, I'm the youngest child, so I always get made fun of for being the one who was, I guess, overly, what's the word I'm looking for? Coddled, maybe is the word, but I don't know. Um, so the last part would be like, what is, it still seems to be like a common, maybe it's like a refraction, where like a kid's 1 or 2 years old, you smack them on the bum if they're misbehaving. So that still seems to be a common pattern because, like, it works in the sense of they now feel that fear or threat. But, like, it seems like a lot of the behavior stuff, again, speaking as a non parent, fundamentally comes down to how you change your response to the behavior that you're seeing. Yeah.
when I was thinking about naming my company, a friend was like, "You should name it like it's not you, it's not them, it's you," because it really is about behavior comes down to what happens after. So the way that we respond to it, the way that they're accessing reinforcement, that is what continues a behavior. So we have to proactively build in, and again, that skill set, teaching that skill set. And if we're spanking and it's just like, okay, I won't do that again, we haven't really learned how to generalize any skill across the board or what to implement next time or anything like that. So punishment by definition decreases a behavior, but
Mhm.
any behavior you want to decrease should have a replacement behavior you want to increase. So if your toddler's ripping a toy out of somebody's hand, I want to increase them asking for a turn or saying please or getting a different toy. So for me, that would be a big takeaway for parents is really what do you want them to do instead?
Yeah, because even like not just at my school, but there's always that. Do we have a massive detention system? Do we have no detention at all? And it always comes down to this like back and forth. And I've made it a purpose. It doesn't come up as much in high school of like, because usually the kids who are kind of like the misbehaving type will typically be the ones who are just kind of more quiet and isolating themselves. They're not so much like the class clown trying to get everyone's attention. So you don't really have to raise your voice. I make it a point to not yell in my class. Even if like something is absolutely egregious, I usually kind of just like let things play out. And but I've even found that like after the fact, like people will almost like look at you and you're like, you must not be a very good teacher if you're not yelling in your class. And I'm like, that doesn't even makes I don't know, something that doesn't really make sense to me. Um, but I guess for one of my last questions to ask you, I won't keep you too much longer, would be if you had to kind of distill all of your practices, all of your kind of core knowledge that you've had and the experience with your people that you've counseled, if you had to have three main principles for parenting, what would they be? Even just one, but
Yeah, so to be aware of function, there's 4 functions
Mhm,
of behavior: attention, escape, access to something, and automatic or sensory, and to work on replacement behavior. And then the
mhm,
last one would be to have a realistic criteria for yourself. So like you talked about in the beginning, we have to shape this behavior. So what is our first step? Again, we often work in extremes like I don't want you dumping on the couch ever versus like okay, well how can we he jumps on the couch 7 times a day. Let's try to get to 5 and then 3 and how do we shape this? Because parents tend to work in extremes and then give up when it's not zero versus incremental progress along